Naval warfare in the Warcraft series has always been something that's been glossed over, to say the least. Now, it is important in the lore. The very reason we go to Zandalar and Kotaras and BFA is because of their fleets. But naval combat itself, including tactics, has always been odd. And we're going to dive into that. I'm gonna put my history degree to use, damn it if this is not my specialization. So this video will be a look at how naval combat has evolved throughout Warcraft lore while also drawing heavy parallels with the real world. Before we get into the meat of the topic, I do have to discuss a few caveats. First off, as has been often pointed out in the fandom, most ships in World of Warcraft should not be able to sail, at least not well. Their center of gravity is often too heavy, meaning they would just flip over, or their sails are too small, meaning they wouldn't really be able to actually move much, or they lack rigging, meaning they wouldn't even be able to manage those sails, etc. Sometimes ships are not even placed right in the world, as the example my character is standing in the Horde Garrison shipyard shows. In Blizzard's defense, they have begun to fix this with many of the new ship models in Battle for Azeroth, especially with the Kultiran and the Forsaken models, but they still look more fantasy than actually functional, if that makes sense. Now, caveat number 1 out of the way, caveat number 2 is the existence of magic in the Warcraft universe as opposed to the real world. And this is a caveat because you could often say, well, this thing about naval warfare actually makes sense because of magic. And in some cases you would be right. I'm going to go more in depth when we get to those individual cases, though in general magic is not really the deciding factor here. The final caveat is that I'm not going to discuss naval warfare in the RTS games. The reason for that is, well, they are limited by their engine and what they could do. In the RTS games, ships pretty much act like any other ranged attackers, except that they can move on water and some of them carry troops. As a side note, the RTS games are part of the reason why especially the older ships in World of Warcraft are poorly designed from a naval architecture point of view, since Blizzard based many of these earlier models on designs from the RTS games. Now, naval combat in World of Warcraft is, perhaps unintentionally, a mixture of a bunch of real-world naval events and traditions, ranging from, well, Greco-Roman antiquity to mid-20th century developments, and yet it's primarily centered on somewhere between the 16th and 19th centuries Western European tradition, and yet the terminology and the naval jargon they use is often 20th and 21st century. Just to touch a bit on the last point, since I don't really want to repeat it throughout the video, instead of using more period appropriate terms like ship of the line, galley, or frigate, the Warcraft universe uses terms which are typical of 21st century ships like battleship or destroyer, and tries to force these anachronistic terms on ships which don't really fit the bill, but I digress. Let's take things in chronological order. The first time we really see naval warfare in Warcraft in a really big fashion is during the Second War. After all, one of the big features Warcraft 2 was advertised with was naval combat. As stated, I won't touch upon the game mechanics of Warcraft 2, but exclusively focus on the lore. Now, on one side we have the humans and the High Elves, who mainly use sailing ships typical of the 16th to 18th centuries in Europe. The main way to fight naval battles in Europe at the time was to line up the ships and have them fire on each other with the cannons they have on their sides. And obviously ships at the time had the majority of their cannons at their sides because that's where you could fit most of them. In the Warcraft world, High Elven and human ships at this time function in pretty much this way, only that High Elven ships sacrifice some of their size and firepower for mobility and speed, which is unconventional thinking for how real-world naval tactics evolved, which tended to emphasize bigger and bulkier ships as the preferred option, but it's also not entirely out of the norm, so far so good. To make things a bit odd though, human ships in the Second War, as well as the revamped Cataclysm design and the Kultir's design, also come with a battering ram in front, which is odd. ramming is definitely not the preferred tactic these ships should use, and there haven't really been any instances where they've used it, but, well, I suppose if you can afford it, then sure, why not? On the other side, we have the Horde, and the Horde ships are, well, in some ways really interesting, in other ways, they pose some issues. Now, for one, we have the Orcs, who are not a seafaring people, and so either took over some of Stormwind's ships or had the Ogres, who had a navy on Draenor, build them ships. The Orcs and their contrast with the humans in this case actually follows two interesting examples in history. That of the Roman navy during the First Punic War, which is in the 3rd century BC, and of the Japanese navy during the Imjin War in the late 16th century. Namely, the Romans at the time were also not used to naval combat, like the Orcs, and so they copied Carthaginian designs but heavily refocused them. Instead of fighting in the traditional Carthaginian and Greek way involving ramming and maneuvering, the Romans preferred to use boarding tactics, basically turning naval battles into smaller land battles, which was their forte. And this is also what the Orcs did in the Second War. Heavily inexperienced with naval battles, they turned to building bulky ships with which to ram and board the Alliance vessels. This leads to the earlier parallel of the Imjin War that I mentioned. In there, the Japanese also heavily preferred boarding tactics, while their enemies, the Koreans, generally speaking preferred to keep their distance and use their superior firepower to destroy the Japanese. Spoilers, the Koreans, like with the humans in Warcraft 2, won the naval side of their respective wars, and in both cases by a significant margin. To throw a wrench in the mix, in the Second War we also have the Gnomish submarine on the Alliance side and the subjugated giant sea turtles on the Horde side, which were both used as submersibles. Now, in both cases these were stated to be brand new technology, and so they weren't developed to their fullest extent. I mean, just imagine what one fully equipped submarine could do to a conventional fleet. Those ships have no way of responding to its attacks except to corner it at port or when it re-emerges. There were no depth charges yet. And indeed, like for example in World War I, these early submarines were used to great effect during the war, but because they weren't really extensively developed yet, they weren't exactly used to their full potential. To throw a bigger wrench into the mix, we have the incredibly odd Ogre Juggernauts and Troll Destroyers. Now in regards to the latter, they are supposed to be the lighter, faster ships of the Horde fleet, but well, their design doesn't effectively hint at that. Now, the way they were intended to be used in the lore is to use their supposed speed to cut through enemy lines and deal damage rapidly. On this theoretical side of things, it makes some sense in that the large ships typical of human fleets, like the ships of the line of 18th century Europe, are not the most maneuverable, and hitting them in their weak spots would hurt, but again, this is just theoretically speaking. Practically speaking, many of these ships are so small in size that they probably could barely do anything. There's a reason why the majority of large-scale naval battles in 18th century Europe were dominated by big ships, not their supporting frigates. Then there's the Juggernaut, which, well, definitely fits with the Ogres and the Orcs aesthetically. It's a gigantic, clumsy monstrosity with a big cannon in front. There's a few problems with it, to say the least. First off, its shape, which is basically like an oval with too much fat on the sides. Now, ships in the real world from ancient times to today have an elongated shape because of, well, physics. To put it simply, it's much easier to move when there's less of a surface that's resisting the water. Now, I suppose we can chalk this questionable design choice to the Orcs and Ogres being either inexperienced with ship construction or just dumb, but really, even for them, it's hard to see how they would make this mistake. And in fairness, the Juggernaut is a very slow ship. Now, it compensates this by having massive steam engines and gigantic cannons that can shoot in every direction. Before we talk about the steam engine, which is a whole other can of worms, having these cannons that can shoot in every direction is theoretically an advantage, but I would imagine more so if you are dealing with fast ships that sort of try to sail in circles around you, which the Alliance ships in the Second War were definitely not. Like I mentioned, they were more of the classic 17th to 18th century European ship, where the main tactic would be to line up and unleash hell with the massed cannons they have on one side of the ship. Now, and I would be remiss if I did not say this, but in real life there is a tactic called crossing the T, something for which the British Admiral Nelson, for instance, was well known. Basically, it means slicing through the enemy ship line, which would be arrayed in the classic line formation, and as you're passing through the line, unleash the cannons you have on the sides and fire into their most vulnerable bits. The problem is that this tactic is rather hard to apply to orcish juggernauts because, for one thing, they are really slow. By the time they would reach the enemy line to cross the T, they would have been shot to bits. And also, while they do have cannons on all sides of their ship, the strongest and biggest and meanest cannon is on their front. Now, this cannon is also a bit of a conundrum because it is so enormous. To point out another example in history, let's look at the Great Bombard the Ottoman Empire used in the Siege of Constantinople of 1453, which is a cannon I would say would be fairly similar in size and technology. Now, that cannon was so massive and difficult to wield, and also each shot so overheated the cannon that it could only fire 1 to 2 shots a day. Now, let's be generous and take the fantastical elements of Warcraft into account. Orcs and ogres are physically stronger than humans, sure, and maybe there's some magic they could have used to reload the cannon faster. Faster maybe, but definitely not enough to keep up with the speed of the more typical Alliance and real-world historical naval cannons. Really, all of these factors mean that the best tactic for a fleet of orcish juggernauts facing an Alliance fleet would be to get into range, fire their main cannon, and then rotate in place, firing all the cannons on their sides in order to maintain a continuous barrage, while the crew desperately struggles to reload the main cannon in time for it to get into position to fire again. And well, I'm fairly sure the naval battles in the Second War weren't fought like that. Now, moving on to the elephant in the room, the steam engine. In real life, steam engines were a massive advantage. They basically meant that a ship was no longer at the mercy of the wind and could maintain a decent speed in an adverse wind and pretty much always outrun other ships. Which is why it's so odd that this piece of advanced technology, well, relatively speaking, was present on orc juggernauts but not on Alliance ships. And you could say, oh well, the goblins probably provided the orcs with steam engine technology. Sure, but the Alliance also had dwarves and gnomes who at the time designed aircraft which worked on combustion engines. Now, if you want to think of technology like a civilization tech tree, which you shouldn't, but let's do so for the sake of argument, a combustion engine is more advanced than a steam engine. But despite this, even 30 years later in the lore, steam engines, or combustion engines for that matter, on ships have only been used on random goblin and gnome ships, the super advanced Iron Horde style ships, which we'll talk about more later, and on Alliance icebreakers, which are lightly armed transport ships designed just to clear the naval path to Northrend for the more classical sailing Alliance battleships to get through. Now, given the sometimes massive investments we've seen in military technology that the Horde and Alliance have brought over the years, it really seems odd to me that something so simple yet so effective as a basic steam or combustion engine has not been added to the majority of their warships, which instead still mostly operate on the classic sailing technology. Now, you could point out that magic exists. The famous Kulturan tide sages, for instance, who manipulate the wind to steer ships in the right direction. And you could make similar, though a little flimsier arguments for spellcasters such as shamans doing the same for their race's ships. And yes, that's very true. But on the other hand, which is simpler? Training a tide sage for years and years until they master the spellcraft, or building an engine? I mean, there is a reason why we still have ships in the Warcraft universe when mages with portals exists. Namely, that the number of mages that could be relied upon to maintain constant portals for moving massive quantities of people and goods is very limited compared to the actual demand. There's also no reason why they can't coexist. Imagine the speed advantage of a ship would have with both a Tide Sage and a steam engine. Before moving on to the developments Alliance and Horde shipwrights got during the Cataclysm and more massively following Warlord of Draenor, I'd like to talk about the other seafaring cultures of Azeroth. Let's start with the Kvoldir. Now, the Kvoldir act like the Viking raiders of early medieval Europe do, sail in longboats to raid the coastlines and also, notably, fight underwater against the Naga typically. And well, obviously, small longboats don't really stand a chance when facing a conventional ship of war, they would just get blown to bits. Which is why the Kvoldir also utilize unconventional tactics in the rare instances they face off against more typical warships. Namely, as they generally do, their very appearance shrouds the entire area in dense mist, severely lowering their enemy's visibility and, by extension, their chance to hit a target. Then their preferred tactic, given their lack of weaponry that can damage a ship, is to use this mist to board the enemy. Essentially, as the Orcs did in the Second War and as the Romans did in the First Punic War, turn a naval battle into a land one. Only, in the case of the Kvoldir, unlike in the other two, often in ambush-style tactics. Furthermore, they also employ Kraken in naval battles, massive beasts that can destroy entire enemy ships. Next, I'd like to talk about the Night Elves and the High/Blood Elves and their ships, which are somewhat similar. Now, I've mentioned that High Elven ships in the Second War were similar to human ships in design and tactics, only they sacrificed a lot of firepower in exchange for speed and maneuverability. There's more to it than that though when it comes to armament, in that while the human ships have cannons, the High Elven and Night Elven ships have glaive throwers and ballistas, which are, well, not as effective in ship-to-ship combat. You could argue, and you'd probably be right, that the High Elves and the Blood Elves also utilize mages to bolster their ship's firepower, and yes, that would be a big advantage given that they are a much more magically attuned race than, say, the humans. On the other hand, you couldn't really make the same argument for Night Elven ships. Now, in the World of Thorns, the events which led up to the burning of Teldrassil, we do see Night Elven ships used in a way real-world ships have also been used to great effect, in providing naval bombardments. Basically, each ship has so much artillery on it that it not only equals, but often surpasses actual land armies, and they use that to that effect. However, in that particular case, the armaments the Night Elves used were only good enough to keep the Horde off of the beaches for a bit. In ship-to-ship combat, even the clumsier Orc designs could probably beat Night Elf ships. Now, this does make sense in that the Night Elves, for much of their history, had no one to contend with on Kalimdor in terms of naval power, so obviously there wasn't much of a reason to invest in it. Night Elven ships, compared to Blood Elf and High Elf ships also, are more so based on the real-world Arab Doe, which was a trading and cargo ship, not really a warship, and in the real world, when those came into contact with European carracks and caravels, they lost. Next, in a somewhat comparable case, are the Zandalari and their navy. Now, there's multiple problems with it, namely, with the fact that it's been stated, at least before the Alliance wrecked it, that it was one of the most powerful fleets on Azeroth. The issue with that is its armaments, which is, once again, ballistas. Now, the famous Talanji cinematic where she parts the mists and the Golden Fleet obliterates an Alliance squadron isn't really how ballistas would work. I'm sure you've heard of the many problems regarding flaming arrows and the like, which are utilized way too often in fiction. If you haven't, basically flaming arrows don't really work that well because, generally speaking, the fire is extinguished in midair due to the sheer speed and the resulting wind. Basically, in the real world, you would generally use flaming arrows if you were in close range to the enemy to increase the chances that the fire wouldn't burn out. And yet, the Zandalari ballista ammunition not only does not burn out, it also explodes. Now, leaving aside this flaw in the application of physics, the Zandalari Golden Fleet in general seems to work as a sort of an artillery fleet, which is actually somewhat similar to how naval combat was typically done in the classical era, with artillery exchanges between ships combined with ramming and boarding actions. Though there isn't really much ramming with the Zandalari ships, and it would also definitely end badly if they tried to ram anything other than, I guess, a Gvoldir longboat. Now, this method of war does have certain advantages, like you see in the Tolanji cinematic, again leaving aside the physics failure. And I could certainly see the Golden Fleet playing a valuable support role within the Horde Navy. But there are also plenty of disadvantages, namely that, well, they're artillery without much protection. So if an enemy fleet manages to survive their initial barrage, once they're within closer range, their cannons would rip the ships to shreds. They're also, unlike the more modern Alliance and Horde designs, made of wood, not steel, which does pose plenty of vulnerabilities. Now, the Golden Fleet does have some ships which are more capable of medium to close range ship-to-ship combat, namely the larger battleships which feature multiple gun ports on the sides. The problem is, first off, this type of ship is much rarer than the smaller artillery ships, and they're also armed with ballistas, smaller ones this time, not cannons. So I suppose the statement that the Zandalari Golden Fleet is one of the greatest on Azeroth is more something of a reputation, or that in the context of how depleted the Horde and Alliance fleets are by the time of battle for Azeroth, they would constitute something great. Now moving on, let's talk about the innovations brought about by Cataclysm, namely the Alliance battleship and the Horde destroyer. Now the Alliance battleship is pretty much an upgraded version of the old design, featuring armor and more cannons, though still not nearly comparable with the actual cannon armaments of real-world ships of the line. This design, for instance, has 8 guns on each side, totaling 16, while real-world ships of the line range from a total of about 50 to over 100 cannons. Anyway, other than that, not much more to say about them. I'll also take this opportunity to briefly touch upon the Kotaros fleet, which is basically the same design as the Alliance fleet, only better, though they still don't quite have the number of cannons real-world ships have. Orc destroyers, on the other hand, are described as lighter ships than the Alliance battleships, though the Horde tends to force them to take on the role of full-fledged battleships most of the time. These Horde destroyers are smaller than the new Alliance battleships, so they have fewer cannons and armaments, and yet are armor-plated, so they're also slower, and again they lack a steam engine. As seen in the Mists of Pandaria cinematic trailer, they're pretty much equal to the old design of the Alliance battleship, which I could see. While the Orc destroyer may perhaps be slower and have fewer cannons, it does have stronger armor than the old design Alliance battleship. Now, and this is where it gets interesting, we have the innovations brought about by the Iron Horde and its Iron Fleet, which are basically taking existing older Orc designs, adding on a bunch of Goblin technology, and putting them in the hands of the genius engineer Solog Rourke, even if he considers the Iron Horde application of his designs to be over-encumbered and wasteful and monstrous from an engineering standpoint. Basically, he took the existing Orc Juggernaut design of the Second War and heavily improved upon it, with a better engine, a more fluid shape, which both allow you to attain greater speeds than the old model, stronger armor, and likely much more advanced cannon. This design is the Iron Horde Dreadnought. Now, while it also improves on the old Juggernaut and eliminates many issues, there are still problems with the design, as its author himself has stated. Namely, it's still slower than other contemporary designs, and it has a massive vulnerability with its engine, which by necessity has to be exposed and can be targeted to make it explode. As Solok Rourke himself stated of the design, bigger isn't always better. Next up we have the carriers, and where to even begin. In the real world, carriers revolutionized naval combat. It was no longer fought with battleships armed with guns facing each other, rather by sort of proxy via the planes each carrier got. Even a single carrier gives the fleet a massive advantage against one that does not have any. So naturally, they should also revolutionize naval warfare in the Warcraft universe. Well, not exactly. The main difference between our real world and the Warcraft universe is that the aircraft is nowhere near as advanced. In fact, they more so resemble World War I biplanes at best. This is leaving aside the massive gunships which, well, don't really need a carrier to say the least. So the advantage of having a carrier in a fleet is somewhat minimized in that regard. Nevertheless, carriers have begun to make their appearance outside of Draenor on our Azeroth, mainly in the Horde fleet defending Nazmir against the Alliance. And indeed, it does provide a massive tactical advantage over the enemy, yet still, it is limited by the relatively basic designs of the aircraft it can work with. So this is naval combat in the Warcraft universe, where Greco-Roman style ships fight in the same fleets as aircraft carriers, and yet it somehow to some extent makes sense, and yet in many others it doesn't really. Thank you all very much for watching and listening to me, and I'll see you all in my next video. Farewell.